I never planned to spend the entire night trapped on a train with Garrett. If you'd asked me that morning what my biggest concern was, I probably would have said making it through another awkward family dinner without my mom asking why I was still single. Getting stranded somewhere in the middle of nowhere with a guy I couldn't stop thinking about definitely wouldn't have made the list. Especially not Garrett. The thing about Garrett Hayes was that he made every room feel smaller without even trying. Not because he was loud, he actually wasn't. He just had this presence that pulled people toward him naturally. Tall, dark hoodie half zipped, headphones always hanging around his neck like he existed inside his own soundtrack. The kind of guy who looked calm even when everyone else was losing their minds. Unfortunately for me, I'd had a crush on him since sophomore year. And unfortunately for me again, he knew it. Not officially. I'd never said anything. But people notice things. The way your eyes linger too long. The way you suddenly volunteer for group projects you'd normally avoid. The way your entire personality changes when someone walks into the room. Garrett definitely noticed. Which was why we mostly existed in this weird, almost friends limbo where we joked around in class, occasionally texted, but never crossed into anything real. Close enough that I couldn't move on. Distant enough that I couldn't get hurt. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The train station was packed when I arrived that evening, rain hammering against the glass ceiling hard enough to blur the city lights outside. Delays flashed across every screen. Typical. I was standing in line for coffee when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Mason. I turned so fast I nearly dropped my wallet. Garrett stood there holding a duffel bag over one shoulder. Damp curls pushed back from his forehead from the rain. He looked tired. Really tired. Oh, I said intelligently. Hey. He smiled a little. You heading north too? Yeah. Visiting my parents. Same. Of course. Same hometown. Same train. Same universe apparently deciding I hadn't suffered enough already. The announcement system crackled overhead. Attention passengers. Due to weather conditions, all departures are currently delayed. A collective groan moved through the station. Garrett looked toward the windows. Looks bad. It'll probably clear up, I lied. It didn't. By the time we finally boarded, it was almost midnight. Half the passengers were irritated, exhausted, or asleep before the train even started moving. Garrett and I ended up sitting across from each other because every other seat nearby was taken. For the first hour, things stayed easy. Casual. We talked about school, finals, his internship, my terrible apartment heating situation. The kind of conversation two people have when they're trying very hard not to acknowledge the undercurrent sitting beneath every word. Then somewhere around 1:30 in the morning, the train stopped moving. At first, nobody panicked. A few annoyed sighs. Some people checking their phones. One guy muttering something about suing the railway system dramatically. Then the conductor's voice came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, due to severe weather and debris on the tracks ahead, will be temporarily stopped until further notice. The cabin erupted immediately. How long? You serious? You've got to be kidding me. I looked out the window. Nothing but darkness and heavy snow now replacing the rain. Garrett leaned back in his seat slowly. Well, he said, guess we're not getting home tonight. Something about hearing that sent a strange nervous energy through me. An entire night. Just us. Trapped together. I told myself that didn't matter nearly as much as it actually did. Around 3 in the morning, the train got quieter. Not calmer exactly, just defeated. Most people gave up complaining and tried to sleep sitting upright. Lights dimmed overhead, casting everything in soft blue shadows. Outside, snow covered the windows so heavily it looked like we weren't moving through the world anymore at all. Garrett sat across from me with one earbud in, knee bouncing lightly under the table between our seats. You ever notice, he said quietly, how disasters make strangers weirdly emotional? I looked up from my phone. What? He nodded toward the aisle. An older couple 2 rows ahead were asleep, holding hands. Across from them, a woman had somehow convinced 3 strangers to share snacks with her like they'd known each other for years. People act different when they realize they're stuck somewhere together, Garrett said. You saying we're in a disaster movie? Depends. Are you secretly a serial killer? I snorted. You'd be dead already if I was. That's fair. The smile he gave me afterward lingered slightly too long. My stomach flipped in the most embarrassing way possible. God, 22 years old and still reacting to him like a teenager. You tired? He asked. Not really. Liar. I physically cannot sleep sitting up. Same. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Garrett stood suddenly. Come on. I frowned. Where are we going? Observation car. There's an observation car? You've never taken overnight trains before, huh? I followed him through 3 nearly empty train cars while trying not to think too hard about the fact that everyone else was asleep, and it felt strangely intimate walking beside him through the dark. The observation car was almost empty. Huge windows curved overhead, snow pressing softly against the glass outside while dim yellow lights reflected across the floor. Somewhere far ahead, wind rattled faintly against the train. Garrett dropped into one of the booth seats and stretched his legs out. This is way better, he said. I sat across from him, pulling my hoodie sleeves over my hands. For a while we just listened to the storm. It should have felt awkward. Instead it felt suspended, like the world outside had paused long enough for something honest to happen. Garrett looked at me eventually. You know, he said carefully, I always thought you hated me at first. I blinked. What? In sophomore year. I laughed immediately. Garrett, I was painfully obsessed with you. The second the words left my mouth, I froze. His eyebrows lifted slowly. I covered my face instantly. Cool. Awesome. Great. Ignore that. Garrett started laughing quietly. Not mean laughing. Worse. Fond laughing. You think this is funny? I muttered through my hands. A little. I'm glad my humiliation is entertaining. Mason. I peeked at him reluctantly. His expression had softened completely. You were never exactly subtle, he admitted. My stomach dropped. You knew? Knew you had a crush on me? He smiled slightly. Yeah. Oh my God. You used to volunteer every time professors paired us together. I was trying to be supportive academically. You brought me coffee before my economics exam. You looked stressed. You remembered my birthday when half my friends forgot. I pointed at him accusingly. Okay, now you're just attacking me personally. He laughed again, quieter this time. Then the smile faded a little. I didn't know what to do about it, he admitted. That changed the air immediately. Outside, snow continued swirling against the windows. Inside, my heartbeat suddenly felt too loud. What do you mean? I asked carefully. Garrett leaned back against the booth, eyes dropping briefly to his hands. I like being around you, he said slowly. Probably more than I should have. Every thought in my head stopped at once. He looked up again, and honestly, that scared me a little. The train rocked softly beneath us. Neither of us moved. I realized then that Garrett looked nervous. Garrett, nervous, which somehow affected me more than anything else he could have said. You could have said something, I managed quietly. He smiled without humor. You make that sound easy. It's not easy for me either. I know. That word settled heavily between us. He knew. All this time, apparently, he knew. And somehow that hurt and relieved me at the exact same time. I should have gone back to my seat after that conversation. Any normal person would have. Instead, Garrett and I stayed in the observation car while the rest of the train slept around us, talking quietly like we'd suddenly unlocked years of conversations we were never brave enough to have before. It was dangerous how easy it felt. I genuinely can't believe you knew, I muttered, staring out at the snow-covered windows. Garrett stretched his arm across the back of the booth. Mason, you looked at me like I hung the moon. Okay, that's humiliating. It was kind of nice. I glanced at him suspiciously. You're enjoying this way too much. I'm enjoying seeing you flustered for once. That implies you've been paying attention to me long enough to notice. His expression shifted slightly at that. There was again that pause. That tiny hesitation that suddenly seemed loaded with things I didn't fully understand yet. I noticed you a lot, he admitted quietly. My chest tightened immediately. The train lights flickered once overhead before settling again. Somewhere farther down the car, someone coughed in their sleep. Neither of us looked away. So why didn't anything happen? I asked before I could stop myself. Garrett exhaled slowly through his nose. That's complicated. Usually means bad. No, he said quickly. Not bad. He rubbed one hand against the table absent-mindedly, like he was choosing his words carefully. He paused. I wasn't really dealing with certain things back then. The way he said it made my stomach twist. Not because I didn't understand. Because I did. Too well. You mean me? I asked softly. His eyes met mine immediately. I mean myself. Silence settled between us again, heavier this time. Outside, snow slammed harder against the windows, wind howling faintly around the motionless train. Garrett looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally. You ever spend so long trying not to think about something that eventually you don't know how to think about it normally anymore? He asked quietly. I swallowed. Yeah, I admitted. His jaw tightened slightly, relief flashing briefly across his face like he hadn't expected me to understand. When people expected things from me, it was easier to just, he shrugged, go along with it. Girls? Mostly. I nodded slowly. He laughed once under his breath. You know what's funny? What? You were probably the first person who ever made me question any of it. That hit me so hard I physically looked away. Because there are some things you secretly dream about hearing for years. And then when they actually happen, they almost hurt. You can't just say stuff like that casually, I muttered. Garrett smiled faintly. Sorry. No, you're not. No, he admitted. Probably not. The warmth in his voice made my heart do something deeply unhelpful. I leaned back against the booth, trying to calm myself down. This whole night feels fake, I admitted quietly. Yeah. Like tomorrow morning, we're both gonna pretend none of this happened. Garrett's expression changed immediately. I don't want to do that. The sincerity in his voice caught me completely off guard. You don't? No. He said it firmly, instantly, like there wasn't even a question. And suddenly the air between us felt dangerously thin. I realized then how close we actually were sitting. When had that happened? At some point during the conversation, Garrett had moved from across the booth to beside me without either of us really acknowledging it. Our knees brushed occasionally every time the train shifted slightly beneath us. Neither of us moved away. I think I spent a long time assuming you'd eventually stop liking me, he admitted after a while. I laughed softly. Unfortunately for my dignity, that never happened. His smile returned slowly. That's kind of terrifying. You're telling me? No, seriously. He looked at me carefully. Do you know how rare that is? What? Someone seeing every awkward version of you over multiple years and still looking at you like that. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Because Garrett wasn't joking anymore. And I didn't know how to handle sincere Garrett. Sarcastic Garrett? Easy. Late night, emotionally honest Garrett trapped on a snowed-in train? Absolutely lethal. You make me sound insane, I said quietly. No, his voice softened. Just loyal. Something about that word almost broke me a little. I stared down at my hands. I tried really hard to get over you, you know. I know. I looked at him immediately. You know that too? You disappeared for like 2 months junior year. That was self-care. That was you avoiding me. Also true. Garrett laughed quietly again. God, I love that sound. And apparently I'd never hidden it nearly as well as I thought. The realization should have embarrassed me more than it did. Instead, sitting there in the dim train car at nearly 4 in the morning while a snowstorm trapped us in the middle of nowhere, everything suddenly felt weirdly stripped down. No pretending. No carefully timed interactions around campus. No escaping into other routines. Just the truth sitting between us. And maybe Garrett felt it too, because his voice lowered slightly when he asked, Did you ever date anyone seriously? I shook my head. A few almost relationships, I admitted. Nothing that stuck. Why not? I looked at him for a long second before answering. You really want to know? Yeah. I smiled weakly. Because they weren't you. Garrett went completely still beside me. The storm outside rattled violently against the train windows. But inside the booth, everything narrowed down to the space between us. His eyes searched my face slowly, carefully, like he was trying to decide something important. Mason, he said quietly. Just my name. But the way he said it made my entire chest ache. What? I whispered. He opened his mouth. Then suddenly the overhead lights snapped off completely. The entire train car plunged into darkness. A few startled voices echoed from nearby cars immediately. What the hell? Did we lose power? My heart jumped instinctively. Then Garrett's hand found my wrist in the dark. Warm. Steady. I got you, he murmured. 3 simple words. But something about hearing them from him alone in the dark while the storm trapped us together miles from anywhere made my pulse completely lose control. Emergency lights flickered on seconds later, bathing the observation car in dim red lighting. Garrett still hadn't let go of my wrist. Neither of us acknowledged it. But neither of us moved either. And suddenly I couldn't stop thinking about how close his face was to mine now. Close enough that I could see the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. Close enough that his thumb shifted slightly against my skin when the train creaked again beneath us. Close enough that breathing felt difficult. Mason, he said again, softer this time. I looked at him helplessly. Then someone further down the car groaned dramatically. Great. We're definitely dying out here. The tension cracked instantly. Garrett laughed under his breath, head falling briefly against my shoulder. And that tiny, casual contact somehow felt even more intimate than everything else tonight combined. Because he didn't pull away immediately. Neither did I. The emergency lights stayed on for almost 20 minutes. Long enough for the entire train to feel unreal. Everything was washed in dim red shadows, turning familiar faces strange and soft around the edges. Most passengers stayed quiet now, too tired to complain anymore. Outside the windows, the storm swallowed everything beyond the glass. Garrett still sat close beside me, too close for this to feel accidental anymore. His shoulder brushed mine whenever the train shifted slightly beneath us, and every single time it happened, my brain reacted like it had never experienced physical proximity before, which was pathetic. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded too fast. "Yep. You look stressed." I'm sitting in red emergency lighting at 4 in the morning next to the guy I've liked for 3 years. I think stressed is a reasonable reaction. Garrett laughed softly under his breath. Then his expression softened again in that dangerous way he'd been looking at me all night. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think you were way out of my league." I stared at him. "Garrett, what? That is objectively insane." "No, seriously. You could walk into traffic and still somehow look attractive doing it." He snorted. "That's probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "I hate you." "No, you don't." Unfortunately, he sounded very confident about that. The thing was, he should have been. Because no matter how much I tried to protect myself over the years, some part of me had always belonged to him already. And I think Garrett was finally starting to realize it. The train lights flickered again before finally returning to normal brightness. A small wave of relieved murmurs spread through the nearby cars. Garrett leaned his head back against the booth. "Damn, mood lighting ruined." I rolled my eyes. "You're unbelievable." "You liked it?" I absolutely did not. His grin widened slightly. God, this man was going to kill me someday. A notification buzzed on Garrett's phone suddenly. He checked it, expression shifting briefly. "What?" I asked. "My mom. Everything okay?" "Yeah." He hesitated. "She's worried." I smiled faintly. Parents here, stranded train in a blizzard, and immediately assumed disaster movie. Pretty much. He typed out a quick response before setting his phone face down on the table again. Then he looked at me carefully. "You text your parents yet?" I groaned immediately. "No. Mason. They're asleep. It's 4:30. "Exactly." Garrett gave me a look. I sighed dramatically and grabbed my phone. "Fine. But if my mother calls me crying, I'm blaming you personally." "She definitely will." "She absolutely will." Sure enough, less than 30 seconds after I sent the text, my phone started vibrating violently in my hand. Garrett burst out laughing immediately. "Told you." I answered with deep regret. "Hi, Mom. Mason Daniel Carter. Are you safe?" Garrett covered his mouth, shoulders shaking silently beside me. I glared at him while my mother continued panicking through the speaker. "Yes, Mom. I'm safe. Are they evacuating people?" "No." "Do you have food?" "Yes." "Blankets?" "Probably." Garrett completely lost it beside me. I shoved his shoulder weakly while trying not to laugh myself. "Mom, I'm fine. Seriously." Her voice softened slightly. "Okay. Just text me updates, all right?" "I will." "And Mason?" "Yeah." "I'm glad you're not alone." My chest tightened unexpectedly. I glanced sideways at Garrett instinctively. He was already looking at me. Something quiet passed between us then. Something that suddenly felt very difficult to joke away. After I hung up, Garrett tilted his head slightly. "She sounds nice." "She's terrifying." "She reminds me of you." I frowned immediately. "Excuse me. You both worry too much." "I do not." He raised an eyebrow. "Okay, maybe a little." "A lot." I nudged his knee with mine under the table. Garrett's smile softened again, then faded slowly. "What?" I asked quietly. He hesitated before answering. "I'm trying really hard not to ruin this." The honesty in his voice caught me completely off guard. "Ruin what?" "This." He gestured vaguely between us. "Tonight." I stared at him for a second. "You haven't ruined anything." "You sure?" "No one's ever looked at me like I matter this much before," I admitted quietly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Garrett's entire expression changed instantly. "Mason." I looked down immediately, embarrassed now. "Sorry. That sounded intense." "It was intense," he said softly. "But not in a bad way." The train creaked gently beneath us. Outside, snow continued falling endlessly through the darkness. I think you matter a terrifying amount to me, too, Garrett admitted after a long silence. My heartbeat physically stuttered. Neither of us moved. Neither of us seemed capable of moving. Because suddenly everything felt frighteningly real now. Not flirting. Not old crushes. Not hypothetical, almost feelings buried under years of avoidance. Real. Garrett rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly, eyes still fixed on me. I kept trying to convince myself it would go away, he admitted quietly. What would? The way I felt around you. I think my brain stopped functioning for a second. Garrett, you'd walk into class and suddenly I couldn't focus on anything else. He laughed weakly, which sounds dramatic now that I'm saying it out loud. No, I said softly. It doesn't. His eyes searched mine carefully. I was scared if I let myself think about it too much, everything would change. Maybe it was always changing anyway. That seemed to hit him hard. Because Garrett suddenly looked at me like I'd said something important. Then very quietly, he asked, "Are you scared right now?" I should have lied. Instead, I nodded honestly. Yeah, me too. And somehow hearing that made everything easier. Not less intense. Just shared. The observation car had grown almost completely silent around us now. Most people nearby were asleep, curled awkwardly against windows or bundled in jackets. The world had narrowed down to this booth. This storm. This impossible conversation happening at nearly 5 in the morning. Garrett's gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before lifting again. Small movement. Tiny, but impossible to miss. My pulse immediately went insane. He noticed. I knew he noticed because his breathing changed slightly afterward too. And suddenly the space between us felt dangerously thin again. Mason, he said quietly. This time my name sounded almost careful, like he was asking permission for something he wasn't sure he should want. I swallowed hard. Yeah. Garrett looked at me for one long second. Then the conductor's voice suddenly blasted through the speakers. Attention passengers, track clearance crews are expected to arrive within approximately 2 hours. The moment shattered instantly. Several exhausted passengers groaned dramatically around the car. Garrett leaned back against the booth with a quiet laugh, rubbing both hands over his face. Wow, he muttered. Amazing timing. I exhaled shakily, trying to recover my ability to breathe normally. Honestly, might have died if that announcement came 5 seconds later. Garrett looked at me again. Too directly. Yeah, he said softly. And somehow that answer felt more dangerous than almost anything else tonight. By the time 5:30 rolled around, exhaustion had settled over the entire train like a heavy blanket. People were asleep in impossible positions. Someone near the back of the observation car was snoring loud enough to become a public safety concern. The cafe car had apparently run out of decent coffee an hour ago, which honestly felt like the final stage of societal collapse. Garrett and I were still awake, still sitting too close together. Still pretending we weren't both hyper-aware of every glance and every accidental brush of skin. At some point, I'd taken off my hoodie because the train had gotten warmer. Garrett immediately noticed the college t-shirt underneath. No way, he said. I frowned. What? You still have that shirt? I looked down. That's from sophomore orientation. My stomach dropped slightly. Why do you remember that? Garrett leaned back against the booth with a small smile. Because you wore it constantly for like 6 months. That's not true. It absolutely is. You're making things up now. Mason, he said calmly. You spilled ramen on that shirt during finals week and nearly had a breakdown. I stared at him. You remember that? You started apologizing to the shirt. Oh my God. Garrett was laughing again now, head tilted back slightly. And honestly, I'd never seen him look this relaxed before. Not at parties. Not on campus. Not anywhere. Like this version of Garrett only existed when nobody else was around to expect things from him. The thought hit me unexpectedly hard. What? He asked, noticing my expression shift. Nothing. That was definitely something. I hesitated, then quietly admitted. I think this is the most honest conversation we've ever had. Garrett's smile faded slightly. Yeah, he said softly. I think you're right. The air shifted again. Not awkward. Just real. He rubbed tiredly at one eye before glancing toward the snow-covered windows. Can I admit something embarrassing? That depends how embarrassing. He looked back at me. When the train stopped earlier, part of me was happy about it. My chest tightened immediately. Why? Garrett held my gaze for a second before answering. Because I knew eventually everyone would fall asleep and we'd finally have to talk honestly. God, nobody should have been allowed to say things like that at 5 in the morning. It should have been illegal. You make it sound like we're trapped in some romance movie, I muttered weakly. Aren't we? I laughed softly despite myself. Then Garrett's expression turned more serious again. I really thought you'd moved on, he admitted quietly. I tried. I know. No, seriously. I looked down at my hands briefly. There were months where I avoided entire buildings on campus because I knew you'd probably be there. His face changed instantly. Mason, I'm not saying that to make you feel bad, but I do feel bad. You shouldn't. Garrett leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting against the table. I think I spent a long time convincing myself keeping distance was the kinder option. That surprised me. Kinder for who? For you. I blinked at him. He exhaled quietly. You like me in this really genuine way, he admitted. And I didn't know how to give anything back without opening questions I wasn't ready for. The honesty in his voice made my chest ache, because suddenly so many years of confusion made sense all at once. You were scared, I said softly. Terrified. I nodded slowly. Not because I judged him, because I understood him completely. Garrett looked at me carefully then. You ever hate how fast someone can become important to you? I laughed weakly. Garrett, you became important to me years ago. Yeah, he murmured. That's kind of the problem. The train shifted suddenly beneath us, metal creaking loudly against the tracks. Instinctively, my hand grabbed the edge of the booth. Garrett's hand closed around mine immediately. Automatic. Neither of us spoke afterward. But neither of us let go either. And suddenly the silence between us felt impossibly loud. His thumb brushed lightly against the side of my hand once. Tiny movement. Barely there. But it sent warmth straight through my chest. Garrett noticed my breathing hitch slightly. His eyes lifted to mine slowly. Everything around us seemed to disappear again. The sleeping passengers. The storm. The train. Just him looking at me like I was something fragile and important at the exact same time. Mason, he said quietly. I could barely breathe normally now. Yeah. For one terrifying second, I thought he was finally going to kiss me. I could see the moment he almost did. His gaze dropped briefly. His body shifted slightly closer. His expression softened completely. Then, you boys mind if I sit here? We both jumped apart instantly. An elderly woman stood beside the booth holding a blanket and looking exhausted. Garrett blinked rapidly. Oh, yeah, of course. She smiled apologetically before settling into the opposite seat. The moment was gone immediately, completely shattered. I stared out the window, trying to calm my heartbeat while Garrett rubbed one hand over the back of his neck beside me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then quietly, without looking at me, Garrett muttered, "We really have terrible timing." I bit back a helpless smile. Seriously impressive, honestly. The older woman glanced between us knowingly. And to my absolute horror, she smiled. "Oh," she said warmly. "You two are adorable." I physically stopped functioning. Garrett looked like he wanted the train to explode instantly. "We're? It's not. We're friends." The woman waved dismissively. "MHM." Garrett covered his face with one hand. I could actually feel heat rising into my cheeks now. This was unbelievable. The woman tucked her blanket around herself comfortably. "My husband and I met on a delayed train in 1978, she said casually. Garrett and I both froze. She smiled faintly at the memory. Spent 7 hours stranded during a storm. Talked the entire night. I stared at her. No, absolutely not. The universe was not allowed to become symbolic right now. The woman looked between us again. Sometimes life traps people together for a reason. Garrett made a sound somewhere between a laugh and complete emotional collapse. I looked down immediately, smiling helplessly despite myself. Because the worst part? Some small, reckless part of me wanted to believe her. After that, neither Garrett nor I could fully recover our ability to act normal. Not that we'd been doing a great job before. The older woman eventually fell asleep across from us, bundled in her blanket with her head resting against the window. But the damage had already been done. "You two are adorable." The sentence kept replaying in my head like psychological warfare. Garrett looked equally affected. At one point, he rubbed both hands over his face and muttered quietly, "I can't believe that just happened." I smiled despite myself. "You mean our 80-year-old relationship prophecy?" She basically assigned us fate. She seemed very confident about it too. Garrett laughed softly under his breath. Then his expression shifted again, gentler this time. You know what the worst part is? What? I didn't hate hearing it. That hit me straight in the chest. The train rattled softly beneath us while dawn slowly began bleeding pale gray light into the storm outside. Snow still covered everything, but the darkness was finally starting to thin. Garrett looked exhausted now. His curls were messier than usual from constantly dragging his hands through them all night, and faint shadows sat beneath his eyes. He'd never looked more real to me. And maybe that's why the next words slipped out before I could stop them. You're really beautiful, you know that? The second I said it, Garrett went completely still. Not embarrassed, not awkward, just stunned. I immediately wanted to throw myself off the train. Sorry, I said quickly. That sounded. No, he interrupted softly. His voice had changed completely. Lower now. Careful. Mason, he said quietly. Don't apologize for saying things like that. My heartbeat went completely feral, because Garrett was looking at me like I'd just told him something important. Like nobody had ever said something like that to him in a way he actually believed before. The realization affected me more than it should have. You make this very difficult, I muttered weakly. A small smile appeared on his face again. You think this is easy for me? Yes, I said immediately. You look unfairly good all the time. That probably builds confidence. He laughed softly, shaking his head. You have no idea how nervous I've been all night. I blinked at him. Seriously? Mason, I almost had a heart attack when you said you were obsessed with me. That was an accident. You said it with your whole chest. I covered my face again immediately. Garrett gently pulled one of my hands away. Hey. That single word softened everything in me instantly. His fingers stayed loosely around mine afterward. Comfortable now. Natural. And that terrified me more than almost anything else tonight. Because somewhere during these endless hours trapped together, Garrett had stopped feeling like a distant crush. Now he felt possible, which was infinitely scarier. The sky outside brightened gradually into cold, early morning blue. Snow-covered trees stretched endlessly beyond the windows now, frozen and silent beneath the storm. Garrett watched them quietly for a while before speaking again. I think this is the longest, uninterrupted conversation we've ever had. That's depressing. We're emotionally repressed people. Speak for yourself, I muttered. He gave me a look. Mason. Okay, fine. Garrett smiled faintly. Then after a pause, he asked softly, what happens when this train starts moving again? The question settled heavily between us immediately, because we'd both been avoiding it all night. The real world. Morning. Home. Reality. I looked down at our hands briefly before answering. I don't know. Garrett nodded slowly. I don't want this to disappear once we get off here. Neither did I. The problem was, I'd wanted Garrett for so long that part of me still didn't fully trust any of this. It felt too sudden, too fragile, like daylight might ruin it somehow. I'm scared this only feels real because we're stuck here, I admitted quietly. Garrett's expression softened immediately. Mason. No, seriously. I laughed weakly. This whole thing feels weirdly intense. We're sleep-deprived, trapped in a snowstorm, emotionally compromised. I liked you before the train, he interrupted gently. I stopped talking instantly. Garrett held my gaze steadily. This didn't start tonight, he said quietly. Tonight just forced us to stop pretending. God, there it was again. That terrifying honesty. I stared at him helplessly for a second before smiling slightly despite myself. You really waited until we were physically stranded to become emotionally available. He laughed immediately. Honestly, yeah, that's insane behavior. I know. Outside, the storm had finally begun slowing down. Snow still fell steadily, but lighter now. Softer. The conductor's voice crackled faintly overhead again. Track crews have nearly completed clearance operations. We expect movement within the hour. A tired wave of relief moved through the train. But my chest tightened unexpectedly, because suddenly the night was ending. And somehow I wasn't ready for that. Garrett noticed my expression immediately. Hey. I looked at him. We're okay, he said softly. You don't know that. I do. The confidence in his voice made something ache warmly inside me. Then very carefully, like he was still giving me every chance to pull away, Garrett shifted closer beside me again. Close enough that our shoulders pressed together fully now. Close enough that I could feel warmth radiating from him through both our hoodies. You know what I kept thinking about earlier? He asked quietly. What? That coffee you brought me before my econ final. I groaned softly. Please let me die peacefully. No, listen. I glanced at him reluctantly. Garrett smiled faintly to himself. I remember standing there thinking nobody had ever paid attention to me that carefully before. That completely destroyed me emotionally. Because he said it so simply. No performance. No flirting. Just truth. I almost kissed you that day, he admitted quietly. Every thought vanished from my brain instantly. What? Garrett looked slightly embarrassed now for the first time all night. You looked nervous handing me the coffee, he said. And I remember thinking if I kissed you right then, you'd probably melt into the floor. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. You cannot tell me things like that casually. His grin returned slowly. You're kinda melting now. Unfortunately, he wasn't wrong. By 6:30 in the morning, the train finally lurched forward again. The entire cabin seemed to wake up at once. People stretched, groaned, checked their phones. Someone actually applauded sarcastically from another car. Outside the windows, snow-covered forests drifted slowly past again beneath pale, early morning light. We were moving, and suddenly everything felt fragile. Garrett sat beside me quietly, elbows resting on his knees while he stared out at the passing trees. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I almost kissed you that day. 3 years ago. 3 years. Do you know how insane it is to realize your life could have changed completely years earlier if one person had just been slightly braver? You're thinking too hard again, Garrett murmured without looking at me. I sighed softly. Can you stop reading my mind? No. That's annoying. A smile tugged faintly at the corner of his mouth. Then he finally looked over at me again, expression gentler now in the pale morning light. You okay? The honest answer? No. Because now that the train was moving again, reality was getting closer by the minute. Soon we'd arrive home. Soon families and responsibilities and normal life would crash back into this strange, perfect little bubble we'd been living in all night. And part of me was terrified Garrett would slowly retreat back into himself once that happened. I think he saw some version of that fear on my face. Mason, he said quietly. What? I meant everything I said. I know. No, he said softly. I really need you to know that. That affected me more than it should have. Because Garrett sounded almost worried now. Like he understood exactly how long I'd spent expecting disappointment. The train rounded a curve slowly, morning sunlight finally breaking faintly through the storm clouds outside. Garrett looked exhausted in the soft light. Beautiful too. Comfortable now in a way he hadn't been earlier tonight. Like somewhere during these endless hours together, he'd finally stopped fighting himself quite so hard. I don't really know what I'm doing, he admitted quietly after a while. I smiled faintly. That makes two of us. I just know I don't want to lose this. The sincerity in his voice settled deep in my chest. Neither of us spoke for a minute after that. Then Garrett glanced sideways at me carefully. Can I ask you something? Depends. Were you serious earlier? About what? His eyes flicked briefly toward me. When you said nobody's ever looked at you like you matter that much. My throat tightened immediately. Oh, Garrett waited patiently. I stared down at my hands before answering. I don't know, I admitted quietly. People like me fine, I guess. But, I laughed weakly. You ever feel like you care about people in this really intense, genuine way, and most of the time, they just don't meet you there? Garrett's expression softened instantly. Mason, I'm serious, I said quietly. I think I spent a long time feeling too much for people who only like parts of me back. He looked at me for a long second. Then very softly, I don't think there's a single part of you I haven't noticed. That almost physically hurt to hear. Not because it was bad, because it was exactly what I'd secretly wanted for years. I looked away immediately toward the windows, trying to recover emotionally. Garrett bumped his shoulder lightly against mine. Too much, he asked gently. A deeply unreasonable amount, actually. He laughed quietly. God, I was completely doomed. The train gradually filled with more noise as passengers woke up fully. Phones ringing. Bags shifting. Conversations starting again. Real life returning. Garrett checked the time on his phone and groaned softly. My mom's gonna interrogate me for surviving a train disaster. She'll probably cry first. She definitely will. I smiled, then slowly faded again. Because we were getting close now. Close to the station. Close to the end of whatever this night had become. Garrett noticed immediately. You're doing it again. What? Getting quiet. I hesitated before admitting. I just really don't want this to become one of those almost things. His expression changed instantly. That's not what this is. You don't know that yet. Yes, he said firmly. I do. The certainty in his voice startled me. Garrett turned fully toward me now. Mason, I spent years trying not to want this because I was scared of what it meant. His eyes searched mine carefully. I'm done pretending now. The train noise around us suddenly felt distant again. My pulse hammered hard against my ribs. You really mean that? I asked quietly. Yeah. No hesitation. None. And suddenly I realized Garrett looked calmer saying that than he had all night. Like finally telling the truth had relieved something inside him too. The realization made warmth spread painfully through my chest. Then Garrett glanced toward the sleeping elderly woman across from us before leaning slightly closer. You know what else? What? She's going to be unbearable if she wakes up and catches us looking at each other again. I laughed immediately, and that seemed to relax him too. For a second, we were just two exhausted idiots smiling at each other while morning sunlight slowly filled the train car around us. Simple. Easy. Then Garrett's expression softened again. Slowly, his gaze dropped briefly to my mouth. My breathing caught instantly. Not again. Not here. Not while my heart was already barely functioning. Mason, he murmured quietly. I looked at him helplessly. And this time, when Garrett moved closer, neither of us got interrupted. I don't think I breathed when Garrett leaned toward me. Everything else disappeared. The train, the passengers, the storm outside. Just him. Close enough now that I could see every tiny shift in his expression, the nervousness he kept trying to hide, the exhaustion beneath his eyes, the way his breathing had gone slightly uneven too, which weirdly helped, because Garrett had always seemed so composed from a distance. And now? Now he looked just as affected as I felt. Mason, he said quietly again, like he needed to say my name before doing something dangerous. My heart was beating so hard it almost hurt. Yeah, I whispered. Garrett hesitated for one tiny second, not because he didn't want to, because he was giving me room to stop him. I didn't, so he closed the distance. The kiss was soft, careful, warm in that terrifyingly real way that immediately made every year of wanting him collapse into a single, overwhelming moment. And somehow the gentleness of it affected me most. Garrett kissed me like he'd thought about it before, like he knew exactly how badly he could ruin me if he wasn't careful. When he pulled back slightly, neither of us spoke. I just stared at him in complete disbelief while my brain attempted to recover. Garrett looked equally wrecked. Well, he murmured softly. That was probably overdue. I laughed breathlessly before I could stop myself. Probably. Okay, he admitted quietly. Definitely. God, I wanted to stay inside this moment forever. Outside the windows, pale winter sunlight spilled across endless snow-covered fields as the train continued moving steadily north. Morning had fully arrived now, but somehow the world still felt suspended. Garrett's forehead rested lightly against mine for a second before he leaned back slightly, studying my face carefully. You okay? He asked softly. The concern in his voice almost destroyed me emotionally. Yeah, I admitted honestly. I think my nervous system just exploded a little. That made him laugh quietly. Then his expression softened again in that dangerous way. He looked at me now. You have no idea how long I wanted to do that. I stared at him. You seriously need to stop saying things that alter my brain chemistry permanently. His smile widened slightly. No promises. The train slowed gradually as we approached a small station outside town. A few passengers gathered their bags sleepily near the exits. Reality again. Garrett noticed me glancing toward them. Hey. I looked back at him. This doesn't disappear when we get off the train. Something in my chest tightened painfully. You keep saying things exactly when I need to hear them. Good, he said softly. Because I mean them. No hesitation again. And honestly, that was what affected me most. Not the kiss. Not the confession. The certainty. Like Garrett had finally stopped running from himself somewhere during this endless night trapped together. The elderly woman across from us stirred awake suddenly, blinking slowly beneath her blanket. Then she noticed us immediately. More specifically, she noticed the way Garrett's hand was still loosely wrapped around mine. Her expression became unbearably smug. Oh, she said warmly. There it is. I physically covered my face again. Garrett burst out laughing beside me. This is your fault, I muttered through my hands. My fault, he said. You're the one blushing like a Victorian man seeing an ankle. The woman looked delighted by that comparison. Young love, she sighed dramatically. We met 6 hours ago emotionally, Garrett informed her. That's still enough. I groaned softly while Garrett continued laughing beside me. And honestly, For the first time all night, the embarrassment didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt light, easy, like maybe I didn't need to protect myself quite so carefully around him now. The train continued slowing. Final approach. Garrett looked out the window briefly before exhaling quietly. We're almost there. I nodded slowly. Neither of us let go of the other's hand. Passengers began standing fully now, gathering coats and bags while announcements echoed overhead about arrival times. But somehow our little booth still felt separate from all of it. Garrett looked at me carefully again. You know what's crazy? What? If this storm never happened, we probably would have kept pretending for another year. At least. That's depressing. A little. He smiled softly. Then after a pause, I don't want to waste more time. The honesty in his voice settled deep inside me. Because neither did I. Not anymore. The train finally pulled into the station with a long metallic screech against the tracks. Snow covered the platforms outside in thick white layers while tired passengers slowly filtered toward the exits. Garrett stood first, grabbing his duffel bag from beside the booth. Then he looked down at me and held out his hand. Simple gesture, but something about it made my chest ache warmly. I took it immediately. The station air hit us cold and sharp the second we stepped off the train. Snow crunched beneath our shoes while exhausted travelers shuffled around us toward waiting families and cars. Everything should have started feeling normal again. Instead, Garrett stayed beside me, so naturally it felt like we'd been doing this forever. Mason. I turned to see my mom hurrying across the platform in a giant winter coat. Oh no, I muttered weakly. Garrett looked alarmed. Why are you reacting like that? She's emotionally intense. Mason Daniel Carter. See. My mother reached us and immediately pulled me into a crushing hug. You were trapped overnight in a snowstorm. I'm alive, Mom. Barely. Then she noticed Garrett standing beside me. Her expression shifted instantly into sharp parental observation mode. Oh, she said. Oh no. Mason, she said carefully. Aren't you going to introduce me? I could physically feel Garrett trying not to laugh beside me. This is Garrett, I said weakly. Garrett smiled politely. Hi, Mrs. Carter. And then, because apparently the universe still wasn't done humiliating me, my mother looked between us once. Just once. Before smiling knowingly. It's very nice to finally meet you, Garrett. I froze completely. Garrett made a strangled sound beside me. Mom. What? She asked innocently. But the worst part? Garrett's hand brushed lightly against mine again as we walked through the falling snow toward the parking lot. And this time, instead of pulling away, I intertwined our fingers. The drive home felt unreal, partly because I hadn't slept, partly because my mother kept glancing at Garrett and me with the expression of someone silently assembling an entire conspiracy board in her head, and partly because Garrett's hand had stayed tangled with mine almost the entire walk to the car. Not tightly, not dramatically, just naturally. Like once we crossed that line on the train, neither of us really wanted to step back over it, which honestly terrified me a little. In a good way. Mostly. You hungry? My mom asked as we loaded bags into the trunk. Yes, Garrett answered immediately. I stared at him. Traitor. I haven't eaten real food in 12 hours. That's fair. My mom smiled brightly. Good. You're both coming to breakfast. I blinked. Mom. Oh please, she interrupted. You survived a transportation crisis together. I'm emotionally attached now. Garrett actually laughed. Unbelievable. He was teaming up with her already. The drive through town felt strangely intimate in the pale winter morning light. Snow covered everything: rooftops, parked cars, sidewalks buried beneath fresh white drifts. Garrett sat beside me in the back seat while my mom talked continuously from the front. And then your father tried to use the snowblower without reading the instructions. I glanced sideways at Garrett. He was smiling faintly while listening, tired eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. And suddenly it hit me all over again. This was real. Not just late-night train emotions. Not just temporary vulnerability trapped inside a snowstorm. Garrett was here, beside me, still looking at me the same way. My chest tightened warmly. You're staring again, he murmured quietly without looking over. I immediately looked out the window. No, I'm not. You absolutely are. I'm sleep-deprived. My eyes are unfocused. Garrett's smile widened slightly. Then after a pause, very quietly, I like when you look at me like that. God, I was never recovering from this. Breakfast at my parents' house was chaos immediately. My dad insisted on retelling 3 different train disaster stories from the 80s that may or may not have actually happened. My mother kept finding excuses to leave Garrett and me alone in rooms together for suspiciously specific amounts of time. At one point, she literally said, "Oh no, Mason, can you help Garrett carry those plates upstairs alone?" Plates. Upstairs. My father looked deeply confused. Garrett nearly choked, trying not to laugh. And somehow that made everything easier too. Because instead of feeling awkward or uncertain around each other now, we kept falling into these small, comfortable moments naturally. Like standing shoulder to shoulder washing dishes while my parents argued lovingly in the other room. Or Garrett absent-mindedly handing me his coffee when he knew I'd steal a sip anyway. Tiny things, but they felt strangely important. "You know your mom definitely thinks we're dating already," Garrett murmured while drying plates beside me. "She's been planning our wedding since the train station. She likes me. She likes literally everyone." "That's not true." I glanced at him suspiciously. "You sound very confident about that." Garrett smiled slightly to himself. "She gave me the good pancakes." I stared at him. "Oh my God, she did. The cinnamon ones," he added smugly. "You're in terrifyingly deep now." He leaned slightly closer beside me. Maybe I want to be. My heartbeat immediately forgot how to function again. Seriously, how was I supposed to survive this version of Garrett? Because somewhere between the storm and sunrise and that kiss on the train, he'd stopped holding himself back. And every time he looked at me now, it felt intentional. After breakfast, Garrett and I ended up outside helping my dad shovel snow from the driveway, which mostly meant my dad shoveling aggressively while Garrett and I failed to concentrate properly. "You're distracted," Garrett murmured beside me. "You kissed me 6 hours ago. Obviously, I'm distracted." "That's fair." Snowflakes drifted lightly through the freezing air around us. My dad disappeared briefly into the garage looking for salt. The second he was gone, Garrett stepped closer beside me, close enough that warmth radiated through both our coats. "Mason." I looked up at him immediately. His expression softened slightly. "I meant what I said earlier." "About what?" "Not wasting more time." The world seemed to quiet around us again. Even the falling snow felt softer somehow. Garrett glanced toward the garage briefly before looking back at me. Then slowly, he reached up and adjusted my scarf where it had come loose around my neck. Tiny gesture, but the tenderness of it almost hurt. "You make me nervous," I admitted quietly. Garrett smiled faintly. "You make me nervous too. You hide it better." "No," he said softly. "I just spent longer pretending." That settled deep in my chest. Because I understood exactly what he meant now. My dad reappeared loudly carrying salt bags before the moment could deepen further. Garrett stepped back naturally, but his hand brushed mine once as he moved away. Intentional. Definitely intentional. And somehow that tiny touch stayed with me the entire afternoon. Later, after the driveway was finally cleared and my parents got distracted watching weather coverage dramatically on television, Garrett and I escaped upstairs to my old bedroom. The second the door closed behind us, silence settled softly between us. Not awkward silence, just awareness. Garrett looked around the room slowly. "You still have these posters?" I groaned immediately. "Don't judge me. There's literally a dinosaur lamp. It's vintage. It's terrible." I laughed despite myself. Then Garrett's gaze shifted back toward me again, and the air changed immediately. Because suddenly we were alone again for the first time since the train. No passengers. No interruptions. No snowstorm forcing honesty between us. Just us. Garrett stepped closer slowly. "You know what's weird?" he asked quietly. "What?" "I thought finally kissing you would make things less intense." I swallowed hard. And his eyes searched mine carefully. It made everything worse. The warmth in his voice sent another dangerous wave through my chest. Then softer. "I can't stop thinking about you now." I laughed weakly. "Now?" Garrett smiled. "Okay, fair point." Snow tapped softly against the bedroom windows while afternoon light spilled across the room around us. And standing there looking at him, really looking at him, I realized something terrifying. I didn't feel uncertain anymore. Not about him. Not about us. Because Garrett was here. Still here. And every time the world gave him an opportunity to pull away, he moved closer instead.